Kia ora and welcome to Cinema in Context, where we discuss all things film and the connections between. My name is Jeremy Downing.
I'm William Chen.
And I'm Sarah Watt.
And each month at Cinema in Context, we discuss two films, one current and one retrospective, with some connection. It could be the same director, the same actor, or a similar theme. This month, we are discussing Flea, which came out last year, but has had general release this side of the new year, and Persepolis, which came out in 2007? 2007. And the connection being they are both biographical stories of refugees leaving, I guess, war-torn countries, and those stories are told through the medium of animation, which is quite a niche genre, animated war-torn refugee biography films. Please be warned that we will be spoilering both of these films, so if you haven't seen them, I suggest pausing this episode and coming back to it at a future date. And to know that William and I are sitting in my dining area in Auckland. And Sarah, would you like to tell the listeners where you are calling in from?
I'm currently in the glamorous city of London in the United Kingdom. Yes.
Very exciting. Sending you lots of love, and it's Saturday morning for us. It's Friday night for Sarah. So whilst we're accompanying our chat with cups of coffee
and under pouring rain,
which feels like it's London weather, Sarah is enjoying a lovely glass of Prosecco.
And we've had stunning weather, beautiful sunshine, and spring is springing. So there you go, guys. Totally the antithesis of your world.
Spring has sprung. All right, well, let's start with Flea. So Flea is an animated documentary, and it tells the story of Amin, who grows up in Denmark, and the story is told through conversations between Amin and his friend, who is a filmmaker. And the filmmaker, admits that as they grew up as high school students, he was not aware of the full story and knew that Amin wasn't ready to talk about it. But what transpires is a range of conversations that I guess are recorded over an extended period of time. And covers Amin's journey from leaving Afghanistan. And it has to be done through animation to keep the identities of the key players private because, and confidential, because there's real repercussions if this was to come out, like people being deported or potentially being imprisoned. So yeah, it's told through that medium. And just have to say that this film has been nominated at the Academy Awards in 3 categories: Best International Film, Best Animated Film, and Best Documentary Film, which
amazing.
is unprecedented. I don't think that's ever happened before. It could have been nominated for Best Picture, which would have been quite exciting. The 4 best ofs categories. Yeah. But that's Flea. I'm going to hand it over to William to give us an introduction of our other film.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy. So Persepolis. Well, before I go into that, guys, last night, so I watched a visually resplendent movie from Iranian-French auteur and comic book artist extraordinaire Maidan featuring a protagonist who keeps receiving advice from these mystical, metaphysical mentors about life's mysteries. It is darkly comic with sometimes shocking bursts of violence that really make you uncomfortable to your core. There are strong underlying themes of women's voices being silenced by patriarchal nightmare, and it all culminates in something that I think could be or could not be seen as closure. But enough about the voices, everybody. Do you guys remember that one?
No. What's the voices?
No.
Do you know, Sarah?
The voices is Maidan Satrapi's, I think, 2014 film starring Ryan Reynolds, where he keeps hearing his dog and cat tell him to murder various girlfriends, and he buries their bodies in the woods and keeps their heads in I guess his fridge, and the heads start talking to him, and it's a very strange movie. Back when Ryan Reynolds did interesting stuff.
Did you say Ryan Reynolds?
Yes.
Wow. So this is 7 years after she'd already hit the big time with Persepolis, because Persepolis was 2007, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. It was back when, Ryan Reynolds was doing more interesting stuff than just playing Deadpool all the time. And she had made Chicken and Plums, which is also kind of biographical story about members of her family back in the 1950s. And then she followed up The Voices with Radioactive, the Marie Curie biopic in 2019.
Well, thank you, William. The Voices, one to watch?
I think so. It's not bad.
Excellent. Well, we'll see how many connections we can make to that film, as well as Flea and Persepolis. Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you. You start with either movie. Where are you at? What are you thinking? What is the London springy air giving you away?
So the first thing to say is I watched Flea several weeks ago and was completely bowled over by it. So completely endorse all of those Oscar nominations. And it was incredibly affecting, as I'm sure we will all agree. I would be shocked if we didn't. And of course, quite sobering and upsetting in many ways. So then I just recently watched Persepolis, and I'd thought maybe I'd seen it before, but it turns out I hadn't seen it before at all, but I knew the poster, totally knew of the film, and just had never got round to it yet. So what I did is I made 2 columns in my little notebook, and I've got Persepolis on one side and Flea on the other. And it's actually remarkable, isn't it, how many similarities there are? And I don't just mean the fact that they're animated, but there were so many aspects that I was like, oh, that's similar in each of the films. And I loved Persepolis. And I found it completely engaging from go to woe. It's beautifully paced. Well, I guess we should talk about really the fact that both stories are about young people, actually both with idyllic childhoods initially, until the uprisings in each of their respective cities and countries, right? Persepolis, obviously, in Tehran, in Iran, and Amin is growing up in Kabul in Afghanistan. And it's lovely how there is this depiction, isn't there, of the idyllic childhood, the strong family relationships, and then literally all hell breaks loose for each of them. And then in different ways, they are both sort of forced to leave their home country, often leave important people behind, and sort of break out into a difficult new life. I thought both were absolutely tremendous, and I think we've got heaps to say about each of them.
Yeah, I watched Persepolis back when it came out in 2007. I would have been working at the Embassy Theatre at the time, and I probably saw it at one of the film festival sessions. And it really stuck with me. It really stuck with me. And so I hadn't seen it until I watched it earlier this week. Since then, and the things that really stand out in that movie, it's very funny. Like the scenes where they're doing the live drawing of the female figure, and she's covered in head to toe in in a burqa hajib. I'm not sure what the right phrase is for what they're wearing, or the is it Botticelli Dawn of Venus, the Venus painting, and it's all scribbled out, which is very
yes,
funny.
The Venus, yeah, with all the nudities. Yeah, that's right.
Censored out, yeah. I did see Persepolis at the Auckland Film Festival in 2007. I remember reading the comic close to where it came out. It was in our library. So Persepolis 1, I think, was in 2000, and Persepolis 2, 2003, I want to say. And just following along, the comics are amazing. I think Maidan is a very, very good draftswoman, and so much life comes out of those frames. And really excited to see the movie in 2007. And I remember really, really enjoying it as well. This time around, again, I haven't seen it for over 10 years. I have, I guess, more mixed feelings than you guys about the film, mostly to do with its storytelling and pacing. But it just, for some reason, felt very dated, specifically to that mid-aughts style of animation and of storytelling. And maybe that's because I saw Flea just a couple of days prior, and Flea is very much a 2021 movie, right? It has stylistic flourishes that reminded me of TV shows or, true crime documentaries, or like the stuff that we do now, 10, 15 years on, that just wasn't in the vogue or even in a filmmaker's vocabulary back in 2007.
Yeah.
So very interestingly, that was something that really jumped out at me.
I agree with you, William. I really enjoyed the first part of the film. What is Persepolis 1 and 2? Where does the break happen?
The break happens when she goes to Vienna as a kid. And
Right.
so Persepolis 2 starts off with her coming of age in Vienna in Austria, and then ends with her leaving once again from Iran to Paris.
Right. I feel like the film for me sort of, I don't want to say dies because it's still great, but it definitely loses its pace when she returns to Iran. I feel like her journey of depression and getting back on track, and then kind of it just sort of ends with her going back to. Did she go to Paris or back to?
Uh, yeah, as she goes back to Paris from
Yeah,
Tehran
it's not really
in
an end. It
'96.
just doesn't feel like an ending.
Yeah.
It just sort of ends because that's where she got to in her life. Is she the director as well?
She is. She
She's
is.
the one that
Yes,
went on and made
yeah.
the films you were talking about earlier.
Yes, yes. So she
Wow.
co-directed Persepolis with Vincent Paruneau, who is also a comic book artist. A lot of the production crew and animators were also comic book artists. And it was produced at a time when France wasn't really making 2D animated stuff anymore because, after Pixar and the Shreks of the world, like all the production houses were moving into CGI.
Mm.
And so I think reading a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, that a lot of them had to relearn like more traditional techniques.
One thing I'm interested in, and you may know the answer to my question, particularly William. I thought it was really interesting that Persepolis is in English, and it has Catherine Deneuve, who obviously is French, and she is one of the characters in a French accent,
Mm.
and it has the real Marjane Satrapi and her voice, but it also has Sean Penn, not making any effort at all to be either Iranian or French, and that's not a criticism at all. I actually, no, seriously, I really liked. I mean, this is not House of Gucci, thankfully. So,
House of Gucci.
yeah, I really enjoyed hearing Sean Penn's voice, and you probably know that Uncle Anoush is played by Iggy Pop, for crying out loud. So, I thought it was interesting that it was in English with American accents, because. But would there
I
have
watched
been
it
a
in
French
French.
version of the film? Did
Yeah,
you?
I
That's
watched it.
The
interesting.
original version is in French, so it's the English dub.
Ah,
Yeah.
I accidentally watched the English dub and was perfectly happy with that.
I also watched the English dub, which is interesting. Yeah, it is. It does feel tonally different from the French dub, if I recall.
Ah, I liked it. I liked it a lot. Yeah.
But of course, Sean Penn and the others do a decent job.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Right. That would make sense because I saw the film had won César, and obviously, if it's going to win the French Academy Awards, I didn't think it was going to be an American. So, got ya. Okay. Now, interestingly or not, Flea, of course, is Danish through and through. Obviously, it also has other languages, Arabic, bit of English, and so on and so forth. And Russian, obviously, but it is ostensibly a foreign film, isn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just on a side note. It's interesting that they have started calling it international, which makes sense to me why they would do this.
Mm.
But international feature as a way to denote a film that I guess is in a language other than English is really what they're getting at. Because there could be international features from an American perspective that are still in
But in the
English.
BAFTAs, which we just had the other night, which was a total letdown, by the way, they do call it film not in the English language. That's the name of the category. But you're absolutely right. You can't call something a foreign film anymore because it sounds, I don't know, like you're from the Empire, which we all are. But, you can't do that anymore. So, yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Mm.
true. I found the films, like you said at the start, Sarah, there's a lot of connections to be made in terms of the journey of both of those characters. And I think the separation from family is a big one. And, what is the compromise for being able to quote unquote live in a free nation? And yeah, just the traumas that both of those characters go through. And it's it's really sad. I guess with Persepolis, she does have that ability to go home, and she does have that ability to reconnect with her family. But in Flea, the whole family are separated.
Although even with Persepolis, I mean, the final line of the book and one of the final lines of the movie is, freedom comes at a price, and she never sees her
Yes.
grandmother again.
Yes.
And that's the cost of her leaving the Iranian society.
Right. And we can only assume, right, that hopefully Sean Penn and Catherine Deneuve make it over to see her in her new life, but that she
Mm,
does not return to Iran, and that's the price that she has to pay. Do you know, can I just say on that note,
Yeah.
I one thing I absolutely love about documentary per se, and particularly these two films, is how much I learn about a culture about which I know nothing, people's lives that I haven't experienced. And I found both films incredibly rich in terms of, um, devastating insights into how other people have had to live. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating that in Flea, and obviously this is a spoiler, Amin has to lie about the whereabouts or the existence of his family in order to count as a refugee, and how that is a shame that he carries with him. It's a lie that he carries with him through relationships, through his life, um, up until pretty much the making of this film. And it's interesting to me because as I'm watching it, I'm mindful. I was mindful that we tend to sort of think, well, refugees need to be honest, and they need to be without what's the word, without recourse or whatever. And if they're coming into the country, then we expect them to be honest, law abiding, blah 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 blah. And that's really interesting when suddenly you have somebody and you realize, well, crikey, he had to lie in order to survive. I would not begrudge him that, and yet he's breaking the rules. Do you get what I mean? And I do not have any issue with his breaking the rules, but can you see where I'm coming from? And I say this within the context of being in the UK right now, where 100,000 people in Britain are opening their homes, or have said they will open their homes to Ukrainian refugees. All the news here is Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. And there will be an expectation that
Wow.
these Ukrainians turn up and that they are all good people, sad people, need to be looked after. And of course, it will be a melange of human life and human existence, and there will be people who lie, and there will be people who are not entirely upfront about their situation. And I think it's important that we understand why people may be forced to be that way. Do you know what I mean? And that is how desperate life can be. And that's what I learned most of all from Amin's situation.
I find that really interesting what you're talking about, Sarah, and it's that idea of sort of the generosity of hospitality, but then all of the trappings that go along with that, and the kind of classism, xenophobia, racism that can so easily be sit alongside exactly what you're talking about, is this expectation that refugees, or if we look at poverty in this country, or different classes of people, that you should just be happy
Mm,
that we're helping you, kind of perspectives.
mm,
Yeah.
And
mm.
I find it fascinating in Flea how the central lie, it's, yes, obviously it will lead to certain very very negative repercussions to Aman if it had come out, but throughout the film, it seems like the main repercussion is within, right? Like the social services and
Yes.
the Danish government is shown to be extremely supportive of him as an asylum seeker. His Danish friends and loved ones are all generally, very, very supportive, regardless of whether they know his history or not. And yet, the main conflict it lies within himself because of the guilt and the almost crushing knowledge that he is basically killing his family, right? For lack of a better term, like he is creating a reality around him where they do not exist, and it really weighs upon him by the end of the film.
And also, if you think about the way that the repercussions for one's identity, it had never occurred to me until watching the film. He spends, I don't remember, 10 years, 15, whatever, saying, my family are all dead, and having to live that identity. So there is going to be a change in his mindset, right? Because if you tell yourself something enough times, I don't mean you start to believe it, but obviously you start to live it. And so to have to be in denial about family who do exist and who you would like to go visit and you would crave to see again must be an extraordinary. I don't know. I can't really get my head around what that would be like to have to do that and to live it, So I hear what you're saying. Yeah, there's a guilt because there's the I'm denying them. I'm almost sort of uh, relegating them to non-existence, but it's also something that you start to feel and live. And when you're meeting people, you're having to perpetuate this lie. Um, it just kind of blew my mind, actually. So yes.
And the moment in the film where he says his final goodbyes to his family before he boards the van of the human trafficker. Oh, that's a very depressing sentence. It's so beautifully done because you don't see the goodbye, right? You don't see the farewell or the hugs or the final well wishes. All you see are his mother and brother, like high above in their apartment balcony, and their tiny little hands waving. And it's from his point of view, from the window of the van, and the van, pulls around the corner, and they just disappear from view. And it's chilling, and it's so sad.
I find the historical aspects of both stories really interesting as well, because I am not an expert in the history of Afghanistan or Iran. I know little bits and pieces through various pop cultural stories, but it's always from the American perspective because that's the majority of the stories that we get about such topics. And whilst you might have your homelands and your things that try and bring about some complexity, it's very much in a post kind of war-torn context. And I really appreciated, like you said, Sarah, seeing both of these countries, I guess, in a much more progressive stage, and before these, well, there already were oppressive regimes, but I guess more oppressive regimes would come in.
And speaking of Americans, I think it's really interesting how both films are staunchly anti-American.
Yes.
And very much of the pointed message that the Americans came in and really mucked things up.
Absolutely. Interfered. Yeah.
Well, and the British as
Yeah.
well, right? In Persepolis, how the British were funding both sides.
Oh, was that the
of
British or
campaign.
was that the Americans that they said were doing that?
Yeah. Well, the British in the beginning, but then the Americans coming into selling weapons to Iraq and Iran and kind of fueling
That's right.
that whole war, which
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dreadful.
Yeah.
And just to think that, and I've known this before, but to see it in this way, where the United States were funding the
Mujahideen
soldiers. William posted in our chat, our group chat, a clip of, or a freeze frame of Rambo 3 dedicating the film to the bravery of the
Mujahideen fighters and down with the Soviets.
which is just such a arm of propaganda in the United States. And then to think of how much they then retaliated against that group. It just goes to show. And I turned to Josh, my boyfriend, we were watching Flea, and I said, oh, this is very pointed at a time where, like, we watched it the week that the assault on Ukraine began by Russia, and just the fact they were in Russia and the United States were involved, I feel very pertinent and relevant to this time.
Yeah.
In terms of tiny stylistic similarities that I wasn't expecting, I liked how in Flea his American, well, in fact Belgian, but his American sort of heartthrob on the wall was Jean-Claude Van Damme, and that Maidan's idol was Bruce Lee. And then she's really into Iron Maiden, and then there's the fantastic bit in Flea where they use, which of course you're going to with an animated film, I guess, they use the idea of Aha's Take On Me video to and they play the song, and they manipulate the animation, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so apt. And so I really loved how both films had those sort of pop cultural, and of course they would, but pop cultural ideation, I suppose.
Absolutely. And the mere fact that you see people watching movies and telenovelas on TV as well of the time, right? In Flea, what do they watch? Bloodsport? Is that what they're seeing?
It could be.
And in Persepolis, they're watching Terminator 2.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's just such, I mean, also very pointed observations of kind of the influence of Western culture and kind of this what the oppressive governments are talking about with Western decadence. Like, this is it.
Or that wonderful sequence in Persepolis where she goes to get the tape, and there's all of those guys with trench coats going, hey, Maidan, Baba,
Engelbert
Maxon,
Humperdinck, or whoever.
just...
Yeah, that's right. Wonderful. And in terms of identity, again, interesting. One film is obviously about the oppression of women within Iran and the religious or the hyper religious context. And Flea is, if not about the oppression of homosexuals, it's very much a story of identity and not feeling that one can be oneself until very much later in one's life. Um, and so both films have that really strong message and sort of through line as well, don't they?
Yeah, the sexuality message is really strong in both movies. And
Mm,
it's quite surprising because I guess it highlights a couple of
Mm.
things to me, which is one, that this is about nations that are sort of promoted internationally as being very oppressive sexually to people. It's made in European countries, which, from my understanding, are much more open with their sexuality. And it's in contrast to American films, which are actually far more conservative than
mm,
might seem on the surface, especially when it comes to discussions of sex and sexuality. Sex is very often used in American films to denote a
Mm.
relationship that is blossoming, as opposed to any kind of real
mm,
discussion of what that means for people. And it's really fascinating. I remember that sequence
Mm.
in Persepolis. One of the key things that stood out to me is when she has that moment with got that boy that she's fallen in love with, and then they sleep together, and he goes, "I realized I'm gay," and like just sort of, and
Yes.
then her just absolute depression
Oh.
afterwards. And equally that, because I went to saw with my boyfriend, so any gay story is going to stand out to us. But that sequence
Mm.
where he tells his brother and his sisters, and the brother gets him in the car, and you think, oh no, what is going, like,
mm.
we were both, I was like, I don't want to see this. Like, the movie's set up for tragedy. And then he just gives him that money and goes, go have fun, and sit at the gay bar. It was quite
Oh,
lovely, even
yeah.
though the actual
Oh, it was
scenario is very
amazingly
weird.
lovely.
It's very
Oh,
weird.
Not going to
sure.
talk to you
But
on the whole trip.
Yeah.
no, but I thought that was absolutely glorious to yeah, that unconditional love and support. And please go be yourself. And here's a club. And
Mm,
yeah, oh, I thought that was lovely. The family relationship in Marjan's situation with Catherine Deneuve and Sean Penn. I shouldn't keep calling them that. They're actually Mr. and Mrs. Satrapi, but to be fair. But they were so lovely and supportive. And when she says, "Look,
mm,
I'll come home, but please don't ask me any questions about Vienna," and they don't, and there's the
yeah.
unconditional love and support, and please come back to us, daughter, and all that. That was really lovely. I couldn't have been doing with any more heartbreak, if you get what I mean. It's like
Mm.
the underlying stories for in both films were heavy enough. I don't need you being ostracized by your family or anything horrible happening in that regard, even though that would be reasonable. Yeah.
Sarah, if I think of you as a progressive, independent, enlightened, intelligent, educated woman.
Well, Jeremy, thank you very much.
I
I'm glad we had this talk.
think about, is it Marjan, her mother, and
Yes.
think of yourself living in New Zealand, and a kind of extremist Christian regime rises up that requires you to cover yourself and succumb to your husband in far more explicit ways publicly. And how would in 2 years on, and you still want to call it your home? I don't know. I'm just interested. How would you navigate that? What would be your thinking?
Whoa, that's a massive question. I'm not even sure how to deal with that. I guess my instinct would be, well, I wouldn't put up with it and I'd go live somewhere else. Um, um, but I'm not, quavering on that because I doubt that. It's just that I've never really thought about that as a thing. One thing I'd like to say is this, and this is on behalf of Muslim women who do not feel that it is oppressive for them to have to cover their hair, for example. And I know that there are degrees of how much Muslim women are covered, and some are completely head to toe, and there's no face, and others the eyes are allowed to show, and others that just the face is allowed to show. And obviously, what we're seeing from Marjan's situation is sort of civilian clothing, if you will, with a scarf over the hair. Now, I think there's a danger as a Western woman that we look at that through our lens and go, oh my God, that's so oppressive. You should be allowed to have your hair hair out for anyone to see it. No, seriously, that's my disparaging voice for people who I think are being well-meaning but ignorant. And I actually know that there are many, many Muslim women who say, well, actually, the idea behind it is that your hair is sacred, and your hair, therefore, is something so precious and beautiful and sacred that it is only to be shared with your nearest and dearest, i.e., your husband, and therefore it's actually an honor almost to keep your hair that other people aren't seeing it, so that when you're with your husband, that's quite a meaningful expression of connection. Do you know what I mean? And just because it isn't mine as a Pākehā woman growing up in a British New Zealand household, doesn't mean it isn't a completely legit way of seeing that tradition. I think then, of course, you can flip that and say, but hang on a second, where's that tradition come from? Has it come from a patriarchal society? How come the men are allowed to walk around in whatever? And Marjan actually makes a brilliant point in the university, doesn't she? When she gutsily stands up and says, why are the men allowed to wear tight trousers? And there's that gloriously awful shot of the fellow sitting with his legs akimbo in the very, very tight jeans. And she makes an absolutely valid point. And so actually you think, yeah, it's also very hypocritical. But I just wanted to make that point. You know, I think we have to be super careful not to assume through our own lens, it's all right for me to wear a midriff top or a bikini or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that, because it's legit for people to say, well, actually, I think that's too much. And I think, actually, for me at my age, it is too much. But that's a different conversation.
I hear you, Sarah, and I guess that's a really good point to bring up. But I mean, the film's making a pretty clear case, at least for Marjan's
Yeah.
mother and
Yeah.
grandmother, that they are very intelligent. That's not to say people who, that sounds like I'm being prejudiced, but I'm just thinking like they clearly have a depiction, an idea of what it means to be a woman. I mean, the mother even says, "I need you to leave because this is not what I wanted for you."
Yes.
And I guess I think about that, and what would I do if New Zealand went a similar way and the alternative was I never get to see my family again? I just don't know what I would do.
Yeah, that's a different question. If you're saying the Sophie's choice of, do you give up the freedoms in order to be around the people that you love, or do you stand up for what you really care about? Well, I mean, welcome to 2022 almost anywhere in the world, sort of, I guess, yeah, it's big.
It's interesting. It's making me think of like, so, something I've never had to think about until I was with Josh is, oh, I need to check those holidays we're going on that it's safe for homosexuals to go,
Yeah.
because, before that, when I wasn't with someone, it wasn't even a consideration. It was like, oh, cool, I can go there, I can go. But places like the Cook Islands, for instance, where I went, they have it's illegal to be homosexual in that nation. You
Oh,
wouldn't even think
wow.
of that.
No.
But there are places around the world that, yeah. So anyways, it's just interesting. The film brings up things that are very contextual to both characters' journeys and lives. But from that, you can extrapolate very relevant tensions. What do you think, William?
I think so. My mind is bouncing off in a slightly different direction. Speaking of contextual and the different, I guess, social mores of different societies. The way the films, I think both films are being received is also fascinating to me. Like Persepolis, it's extremely surprising that they actually showed it in Iran after Cannes. Right, there was I think a government splinter group was protesting it, and then there were a bunch of like Iranian academics who are saying this is actually fantastic for the country and great representation. So it is well represented as Iranian cinema, with some censorship for sexual content. Whereas on the flip side, Persepolis, since the comics came out, and then especially since the film, has been such a contested text in American high schools. Right, it's one of the top 10 most controversial books. Mouse is also on this list. The Art Spiegelman comic about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And they're both works that I think have very, very strong detractors, and people lobbying school boards saying children shouldn't be able to see
Why?
this.
Why?
This is, anti-American values,
Oh,
and it's
okay.
it's nuts. Like on the one hand, the for Persepolis, the country that it really, the author spends her entire time lambasting, is willing to accept it with cuts. And on the other hand, you have, American conservatism being fully not on board with this and saying that we cannot allow our young people to be open to these ideas.
Mm.
I find that super fascinating.
This is an interesting consideration, or what you're saying, William, based off the back of the New Zealand Histories curriculum just being released this week, and I
Yeah.
have had a look at it, and it's really exciting. I found it really exciting, and I was like, "This is great." It's very easy to engage with. It's, I mean, coming from the you know the work that we've all done and do in the teaching. It's, yeah, Māori stories, Pacific stories, and then the kind of colonization story are really relevant things to be learning. But from my understanding, it is getting some backlash from similarly positioned New Zealanders, I guess nationalists, or
Hmm.
not national in terms of the party, in terms of um, that
Yeah.
similar sort of patriotic colonial
Hmm.
perspective.
Yeah.
I'm off social media, team. It's great. I'm doing Lent at the moment, no social media, and I'm missing all of this stuff. So I'm
Oh,
having to
Yes.
rely on
wow.
others. But please tell me if I'm. Is that what you understand,
Good
William?
for you.
um, I'm also off social media.
Oh, good.
I actually, all I do is go to Instagram and watch cat videos. There's a specific cat called Hosiko who is Russian.
Yeah.
And with everything that's happening in Eastern Europe right now, is still posting daily updates. So they
Nice.
must be doing okay in Moscow,
Oh.
getting past the firewalls via VPNs and whatnot. But that's my social media life. So yes, I have also avoided a lot of this stuff.
Have you heard anything with being over in the UK, Sarah, in regards to the New Zealand histories?
Sometimes when I want a little bit of relief from all of the Ukraine war news over here in the UK, I do indeed check in on the New Zealand news. So yeah, I've seen a little bit, and I appreciate that the ACT Party in particular, I think, are being lambasted, to use William's awesome word from earlier, for not being entirely supportive of the curriculum. And so yeah, I only know a little, but I did just want to say, switching back to what William said. I've just looked online, actually, done a little bit of a Google. Don't know if you guys have heard of Google, but it's actually a really good way of like getting facts. But also, just to say, according to this, the book and the film of Persepolis are banned in Iran. So I don't know if they've been unbanned more recently than this.
Uh,
William.
Oh, okay. I'm pretty sure in 2008, it was pretty widely distributed. Maybe it's since been banned. But
Yeah,
my
maybe
understanding
that's
was
it.
that, especially during the film fest circuits, like it was pretty openly, seen by
Right.
people in Iran. So I've talked to Iranian friends who were in Iran back in 2007, 2008, who went to see the movies in cinemas and had a good time.
Yeah, actually, I'm just reading as you scroll down on old Google, it does say it was banned initially, temporarily banned in. Oh no, sorry. This says book and film banned in Iran, film temporarily banned in Lebanon, but then the ban in Lebanon was rescinded due to public outrage. But in any event, I think it's fair to say those Iranian filmmakers often have quite a hard time being able to do their work freely. I think Asghar Farhadi is one who is able to do his work
Hmm.
with his slice of life films about the Iranian people. But I know that there are others who have had to go abroad, and that's the end of that. So yes, tricky times.
It's a really interesting thing, when somebody's story is so heavily censored, and that somebody's own experience would be so dangerous to the regime. And I'm talking about America, actually, and what you're talking about, William. That these stories that are designed to, unpack very real issues that have happened to real people, and yeah, it's just concerning. And it's like, often I listened to that podcast here that you suggested to us a while ago, You're Wrong About,
Mm,
and where they unpack sort of common topics that people think they know about, and then they look at the truth and how things have gone. and they talk a lot about, this the panic around the children. It always sort of seems to come back. Our children is the great panic point that shuts down, pushes through, or disrupts things that really can hurt others. And I think about that debate in the States about Mouse and Persepolis. Think of the children. It's like, I think the kids will be fine. The ones that want to read it will learn something. And then it's a really fascinating thing. And it's the same thing with this histories piece. And I guess it's always going to throw up a debate when you're claiming a sort of a national identity that is perhaps different to the one that's been told and far and wide.
Absolutely right, Jeremy. And often the criticism actually comes because there are people who are saying, well, hang on a second, you can't speak for everybody. So I appreciate absolutely that there will be pockets of the Iranian population who say, well, this is not my experience. And actually, I don't think this is a helpful message for the world. And that's probably the pushback that we're getting about the New Zealand history curriculum in New Zealand, is the fact that there are some people who don't feel that that is our history and it's not necessary and let's not go on about it and why can't we all just move forward and blah 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 and that sort of thing. So yeah, absolutely, it's not even necessarily this is a threat to something didactic that I'm trying to push. It's just this doesn't represent what I think and therefore it's not worth discussing, which irritates me beyond belief, and I'm sure it irritates you as well.
Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Because the same with the Iranian government banning this film, and America, it just goes to show how important these texts are. Because if it's causing that much fear or it's
consternation.
Yeah, it's like, well, okay, and I was saying yesterday when I heard about the pushback of the New Zealand histories thing, I was like, well, it's just proving that we need this. And even if you disagree with it, you still should be able to handle it in your discourse. That is,
but bring in the children. What about our kids?
Yeah, what about the kids?
Speaking of kids, can we kind of finish up by talking about the stylistic touches once again of both these films? Because I just find it fascinating that these are, basically biopics. One's autobiographical, the other one's semi-autobiographical, done in animation. And yeah, the two styles are very, very different. Persepolis is done in that mid-aughts, ink and negative space. I'm thinking of stuff like Scott Pilgrim as well, which came slightly later. And whereas you have Flea, which is very much limited frame rate, very, very expressive, almost, I would say, storyboard-like features. And yet their faces and movements tell so much. And I think both films are really, really beautiful, really, really well made, and express their themes through animation, through their styles quite well.
The most German expressionist kind of moment in Persepolis was when the two nuns, the two, I don't know if they're nuns actually, but the two sisters, or they find it with the tape, and they're sort of like, they turn into blobs, or like they're just with faces, black kind of blobs with faces, and they move and they are such a cool moment.
I think one of the things I will say about Persepolis, even though I just praised the animation a second ago, and going back to my previous point, at the beginning of this recording, like I do find some of it to actually feel really dated, though. A lot of the animation reminded me of stuff like Batman the Animated Series, using the darks and the shadows, except because I guess it was filmed in standard definition. Watching it on the HD screen now, everything seems very soft and blurry, and I don't think that was the intention. You compare that to something like French Dispatch, right? There's a fantastic animated sequence in that movie, and the lines are crystal clear. Like, they're so sharp you could cut your finger on it. And that's what the comic art of Persepolis is like. And then with the film, maybe because of how it was produced, it dulls a lot of the edges. And it feels like it loses a little bit of impact. I think it looks cheaper than it intends to be. Overall, I highly recommend you guys read the two albums, the comics. I do think they do tell the story a little better. Like, a lot of the comic book frames are translated basically one to one in the film. And yet it reminded me of stuff like, Zack Snyder's comic book adaptations like 300 or Watchmen, where he was so hell-bent on preserving the framing nature of the comic book that you lose some of that beautiful pacing in between the frames. And yes, this is Marjane Satrapi adapting her own work, but even then, it just, whereas the comic book, it presents these little vignettes, and it's, they're so self-contained, and you turn a page and it's a new one. I find in the film, it really lends the film a staccato nature. There's lots of fade-ins and fade-outs, and the pacing doesn't quite work as well as a film. The pacing doesn't quite work as a film as well as it does in the comic book. So I found that to be super fascinating, and something I just picked up now watching it, 15 years later.
Interesting
with
you
the
say
current
that.
context of films.
William, I have to say, I don't agree. My experience of Persepolis wasn't like that. I liked the staccato. I thought the pacing was incredible. I thought that the I loved all of the black and white, and it reminded me of Lotte Reininger, the German animator from, well, I guess, was she the war years or something, who did the fairy tales with the silhouettes, and there were a lot of silhouettes, right, in Persepolis, as well as the very straightforward black outline and all that sort of thing, which I found. Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, we keep saying interesting. My gosh, I hope no one's doing a drinking game when they listen to this and play it back, and they drink every time we say interesting. But it is
Please
interesting.
do a drinking game, listeners.
Yeah, why not? Let us know how many we've done. Because it is interesting to think that somebody would take the story of the most traumatic aspect of their life and find a way to animate it. And you said right at the beginning, Jeremy, that for Flea there was a tactical reason because everybody needs to be kept anonymous, but it's also an enchanting way of telling a hard story, and it doesn't lose any impact. Neither of the films softens the blow, because the story is so critical. And we've probably said when we've talked about animation films in the past that, traditionally they are a child's genre, and therefore traditionally they may have felt as though they were accompanying a childlike story. These are very much adult stories. And the Persepolis animation in particular seems pretty sort of basic. I don't mean that rudely, as you say. She's adapting her own work, and it totally works. But yeah, interesting choice of genre, and medium for such an important story.
Well, I think for Flea, the animation also serves the dual purpose of being able to express things that are not possible visually, right? All those breaks where it turns into charcoal drawings, and you see kind of just this visceral reaction to terror or to sadness or depression or claustrophobia. That scene with the refugees inside the packing container was horrifying. Oh my gosh. And just being able to visualize things that Amin has locked away in his memory, I thought was super powerful, and reminded me a lot of the Tale of Princess Kaguya, the Studio Ghibli film, where there's a sequence in that. I mean, the whole movie is pretty, very, very pretty. It's all watercolor, and there's a sequence where the titular princess tries to break away from her very, very cloistered life, and it turns into just a series of low frame rate charcoal drawings, and it bursts into life like blacks and whites and scratchy stuff. And it felt like Flea was really drawing from that kind of energy. And every time it did so, with the faceless policemen in Russia and their eyes being pure white, just amazing stuff, and just so terrifying and visceral, like feeling what the author was trying to express.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Cinema in Context. If you enjoyed our podcast, then please share it with your film-loving friends. You can listen to Cinema in Context through SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, Radio Public, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram, which are great places to let us know what you think of this episode, or give us suggestions for future films to discuss and compare. Look out for our next episode in a month's time, and until then, nor am I.